The heavy shackles were unpleasantly cold on the tender, wounded skin of the girl, all of whose legs were broken into blood. The guards led her to the place of execution, pulling her forward by a chain attached to bulky handcuffs. Both the people and the emperor were convinced of the guilt of the young woman Guinevere, and she was forced to face her death. A huge, red-hot iron furnace, smelted in the shape of a bull, engulfed in fire, caused wild horror. But it was more terrible because of the knowledge that the girl would soon be inside. From all sides, the people glorified their monarch for the execution of a terrible sinner. The emperor himself sat on the throne, completely confident in his decision, and in the fact that he was ridding the world of evil. Large drops of Guinevere's tears mixed with the cold sweat that appeared on her face. Until recently, she was chained to the wall in the tower, sitting on the icy floor and trying to cope with the pain from the wounds received during interrogations. Hearing footsteps, she raised her head, showing the unexpected guest her face stained with blood and dirt. Opposite her stood a long-forgotten young man, Lancelot, her love from that past distant life, which now seemed like a wonderful dream. Lancelot squatted down in front of Guinevere and touched her neck with his warm palms, looking at her exhausted face. The girl looked at her once-lost love, wide-eyed and wondering if he was really there or if she was imagining him. Lancelot said that this time he would not allow this to happen, and his voice was quiet but firm and confident. He lowered his head and pressed his forehead into the girl's fragile collarbones, promising that he would never lose her again. Guinevere could not understand her feelings, but feeling his warmth and strong embrace, she immediately thought about the coexistence of love and hate. Lancelot hugged the exhausted girl tightly to him. His fingers caressed her dirty but still silky hair, while he whispered that he would still find her by any means. Many years ago, Guinevere's life sang with happiness and peace, especially in that beautiful square near the walls of the majestic temple. As a little girl, she reverently held in her hands a bouquet collected to be presented to the altar. She hurried towards the temple, wandering between the lush bushes of flowering plants, slipping her shoes a little on the soft grass. On the stairs she noticed a handsome boy, whose blonde hair shone with some unearthly silver shine. Guinevere stared at the stranger, and therefore immediately noticed that he had dropped one flower from his hands. The boy turned around at her call, blinding the girl with wide blue eyes sparkling like the waves of the ocean. A little embarrassed, she hastened to inform the blue-eyed man that one of his flowers had fallen. The bright yellow petals now sparkled not in a beautiful bouquet, but on the dusty street tiles. The boy was upset because it was impossible to bring a fallen flower to the altar, but Guinevere smiled and handed him hers. The blue-eyed man blushed with embarrassment and tried to refuse such a favor out of politeness. Pure in soul and heart, the little fair-haired girl assured him that there was nothing to worry about and that she did not need to bring flowers today. The boy seemed petrified by the awkwardness that struck the sensitive child's heart and only squeezed out words of gratitude. Guinevere smiled and said that the sooner he delivered the bouquet, the sooner he could go to rest. The girl walked around her new acquaintance, and her white skirt touched the boy's leg, causing him to tremble. The blue-eyed man hesitantly called out to the girl, fighting through all the embarrassment that burned his cheeks and ears bright red. Guinevere stopped and asked if he needed another flower, to which the boy refused. He gathered his courage and introduced himself as Lancelot, and then asked her name. At first, the girl froze in surprise, not fully realizing that such a pleasant young boy really spoke to her about more than just flowers. She hastily smiled and said her name, mentally slapping herself on the forehead for being silent for so long. After this short dialogue, the girl turned around and left, climbing the stairs of the monastery adjacent to the temple. Lancelot brought the gifted flower to his face, and once again, as if tasting it, pronounced the name of the beautiful Guinevere. Since then, they began to see each other and play in the garden, inventing fairy tales and sharing the goodies they brought with each other. As the years passed, Lancelot and Guinevere continued to communicate and become closer to each other. Next to them, they felt like a single whole, relaxed, and all problems slipped into the background with a slight movement. Gradually, childhood friendship grew into youthful love, pure, bright, and inspiring for both of them. One day, Lancelot asked Guinevere to give him a certain promise. He was more serious than ever. He looked at the girl with all love and tenderness, and then said that he would return alive no matter what. Guinevere did not understand what they were talking about, and looked at her lover lost and a little detached. Lancelot asked her to wait, and the girl agreed, because her kind heart was filled with love that could help move mountains. The blue-eyed man promised to tell her everything later, and was about to touch the girl's cheek with his hand, but hastily pulled himself together in embarrassment, and again asked her not to forget and to wait. Guinevere was the embodiment of loyalty and hope. She looked at him and nodded, making a promise. But time passed, first a year, then the next, but her lover did not return. Lancelot disappeared during their childhood, but did not return even when Guinevere became an adult. She waited and believed, but the long, tedious wait could extinguish even the brightest faith in her beloved and the hope that he would someday appear before her again. Guinevere unexpectedly became the wife of a nobleman, and this could not but surprise people who knew that she was an orphan. The motive for this marriage was not love. Both the newly made husband and wife knew this and did not try to hide it. People gossiped that the Duke needed a wife in order to raise his little daughter. Guinevere's new home was a luxurious estate and a mansion, striking the new Mrs. Bright with its grandeur. Her husband, Arthur, did not express a drop of love. He was limited only to a strictly defined line of care, but her little daughter, albeit not her own, loved her. Their union was beneficial to both, and also made happy the innocent creature who previously lacked maternal love and care. But her husband's brother was distinguished by his slippery character. He saw nothing wrong with mocking Guinevere. He literally humiliated her and forced her to serve, driving her into shame and panic with his ill-mannered actions. For example, he could simply pour the tea he brought on her head and order her to run for a new one, demonstrating his attitude to her in every possible way, and their mother never objected. One day, a young family went to the pier, where Sally saw a huge ship and admired it, almost breaking into a funny childish squeak. Arthur and Sally boarded the ship and sailed a short distance to have some fun, while Guinevere remained on the shore, a little afraid of getting motion sickness in the waves. A wind suddenly rose in the bay, stirring up the unruly waves. A downpour began, painfully hitting the face and head with large drops, and the people on the ship could not cope with what was happening. It was gradually being pulled into the abyss. Guinevere screamed, reaching out her hands to the water as if she wanted to rush to the aid of her husband and little daughter. The maids caught her by the arms and did not allow her to fall into the water. Beating the pier with its cruel waves, they dissuaded their mistress and held her tightly together. The fragile family well-being shattered in an instant, dividing Guinevere's life into a before and a terrible after. The downpour continued until the funeral took place in a cold and eerie cemetery. Arthur's brother Gero openly blamed Guinevere for what happened. He shouted at her, roughly grabbing her shoulder and not intending to let go. The grief-stricken girl could only listen to the words piercing her very heart, already broken into small pieces. Gero was distracted when they were called, and released Guinevere, who was barely able to walk to the coffin on her own, looking more like a ghost of a once-living girl. It turned out that she was called by the person expressing the last will of the deceased Duke of Bright. Gero nodded at Guinevere sitting by the coffin, looked at the man with feigned melancholy, and took the paper, promising that he would give it back when the grieving widow came to her senses. The man left, and Gero squeezed the paper in his palm, realizing that now everything, including the wife of his dead brother, belonged only to him, and smiled so that anyone who saw it would break into a cold sweat. Guinevere was overwhelmed with grief, and could not defend herself from Gero, who took advantage of the moment and mocked her in every possible way, and gained even more power when the emperor appointed him duke. Now the blonde felt like a slave, obliged to escort Gero to the imperial palace. The brother of her late husband smiled, and his joy was due not only to receiving the title, but also to the opportunity to gain unlimited power over the unfortunate widow. A darkness reigned over the estate, similar to the one that now enveloped Guinevere's entire existence. Just recently, the girl was pure and bright, but Gero couldn't stand her holiness, and therefore decided to ruin everything at once. He began to use the girl under his control for terrible reprisals, again and again dipping her hands into thick scarlet blood. Guinevere's victims begged for mercy, and did not understand why she had come and why she was taking their lives. Gero enjoyed his position, and at the slightest disobedience, he locked the girl in a dark and damp basement. In addition, he did not hesitate to beat the blonde, not disdaining to use a whip and other weapons that could cause terrible pain. A year later, Guinevere found herself in a crowded hall of the imperial palace. She was sitting on her knees in front of the monarch. The ruler called her full name, and then recognized her as a sinner and ordered her to raise her head. The girl obeyed and looked into the face of the emperor, who accused her of more than 100 murders, and asked how she managed to commit all these atrocities. Guinevere had a piece of her tongue cut off, and her vocal cords were damaged. She could not even answer the emperor. She tried to start talking and wanted to tell him her story, but they were suddenly interrupted. Gero screamed about how the emperor could doubt his man, and the blonde listened to it all with tears in her eyes. The duke stated that the girl was set up, and she could never do anything like that. His voice seemed sincere, and his eyes were full of tears. The emperor looked boredly at the unexpected intercessor and asked how he could protect a sinner. Jiro said that Guinevere was his brother's wife. He knows her well and is grateful to her for all the good she did for the family. The monarch objected to the duke. He said that he had a witness. From the crowd appeared the familiar face of a girl who was Guinevere's servant. The emperor ordered her to tell everything she saw and everything she knew, and the girl obeyed. Fionnuala began the story of how her mistress had changed and what was happening to her in the palace. She stated that Guinevere had no regrets in killing the unfortunate Lady Blanche Florence with a dagger. Continuing her story, she mentioned the following victims, and they were Lady Enrique, Lady Roto, Lady Benita, Lady Chloe, and many others. Fionnuala stated that Guinevere recently got rid of her close friend Samantha, and therefore she stopped being afraid of death and decided to tell everything. Jiro screamed heart-rendingly, accusing the maid of lying. The emperor ordered the duke to maintain his dignity and waved his finger, ordering the sinner to be taken away. For all the crimes committed, the ruler sentenced the girl to a terrible execution at the stake. Her husband's brother seemed worried and lost, but in reality he was just skillfully manipulating everyone around him. A devilish smile stretched across his lips, but then he remembered that the role must be played to the end. Jiro called out to the guards, and looking at one of them with tears in his eyes, begged him to say goodbye to the girl. Having received consent, the man stepped towards the exhausted blonde and lowered his hand to her cheek, stroking the delicate skin. A little later, he moved away and whispered that he himself had told about all her crimes, and then, unexpectedly, he confessed his love and declared that he had been waiting for her for a long time. Jiro seemed so innocent and sad, asking the girl how she allowed him to treat her like that. Amazed by what she heard, Guinevere looked at him with wide eyes. Her hands involuntarily clenched into fists, but she so wanted to close them around the neck of the cruel duke. Jiro mocked her and praised himself for the fact that his plan worked, and then said that he would be the last person the girl would see before she died. He finished his monologue and turned to the guards, wiping large drops of insincere tears from his face, showing that the farewell was over. Guinevere rushed forward, feeling her whole being turn to hatred for this liar. She screamed that it was all his fault, her heart thundering in her chest with rage and fear. The guards easily grabbed the hands of the fragile and torture-scarred girl and dragged her to the place of execution. The red-hot furnace was already open, and under the stormy cries of an angry crowd, strong hands pushed Guinevere inside. The fire engulfed her completely, and the last thing she saw was indeed Jiro's face, who was smiling because his brilliant plan had succeeded. The duke looked at the means of execution with a grin, hearing loud screams and realizing that no one else could stop him from doing anything. Lancelot made his way through the crowd. Not having time to save his love, he screamed and called her. Having managed to escape from the crowd of people, he froze in horror, realizing that the execution had already been carried out. A terrible hellish fire was reflected in his eyes, and at that moment, Lancelot's whole world collapsed. Dying in agony, Guinevere could only think of hatred for Jiro, who had destroyed her life with his machinations and lies. As she said goodbye to the world, she thought about her lost lover and was so sorry that they could not meet again. Suddenly, the pain stopped, and the heat of the flames receded. Guinevere was safe, and her skin was covered with a pleasant cold by the rain and wind. The girl looked around lostly and blinked, realizing that she was again sitting on her knees in front of the hump, just like then, several years ago. Jiro appeared in front of her again, blaming her for the deaths of Arthur and Sally. Guinevere blinked slowly, looking at the cause of her terrible death and trying to understand why she was again at Arthur's funeral. The thought that she had returned to the past for some reason made her laugh loudly in a pre-hysterical state. Jiro pointed an accusing finger at her, asking why the hell she was laughing and calling her crazy. Guinevere could only look straight at him, over and over again, remembering all the pain that the treacherous young man had caused her. Jiro was agitated. He shouted at her, ordering her not to ignore his words. His wide hand swung out to strike, but this time Guinevere was not going to remain silent and endure. She caught his wrist. When she ordered Jiro to get out of sight, her voice was quiet but cold, like the blade of a dagger. Amazed by such insolence, the young man stepped back, shouting again and calling Guinevere crazy. He was breathing heavily and advancing on her with a look as if he wanted to strangle her on the spot. The blonde one called the maid over, looking hardly interested. She pointed to her careless relatives and said that it was hard for them to go through something like this, and therefore it was better to take Jiro and the lady, his mother, away. The maids carried out Guinevere's order, and despite resistance, took away the raging young man along with his mother. A few days later, the girl sat in the office that used to belong to her husband, and was forced to admit that she had indeed returned 5 years ago. She was confident that under no circumstances would she repeat the previous mistakes that led to her execution. Guinevere wondered why she had been given a second chance, but she already knew that she would not take revenge on her offenders with the same cruelty with which they treated her. She only wanted to drive them out of the palace, but this might require connections with influential people from noble families. The girl understood that even if some were not opposed to her, Jiro would try to fix it with the help of gossip and manipulation. Guinevere understood that she had a difficult path ahead, but she had already experienced how Jiro used her for his own benefit, and she was ready to go to the end. She decided to start with the servants of this castle, and the first to come to her mind was Joan, one of Ambassador Thomas's most experienced servants. Before coming to the palace, she was unhappy and unsure of herself. Arthur knew about this and decided to help her. The maid saw him as a benefactor and savior who opened the doors of a luxurious estate to her. Guinevere thought about how to approach this child. While thinking, the blonde heard a noise in the corridor and decided to leave the office in order to see what had happened. There, she heard the screams of Jiro, who scolded the maid for bringing tea in the wrong cup. He waved his hand sharply and threw the cup onto the floor, causing it to shatter. The maid knelt down, collecting the pieces and wiping away her tears. Guinevere approached and saw that the girl had cut herself with a piece of shrapnel while she was cleaning up the mess. She good-naturedly took the maid's hand in hers and pressed the handkerchief to it. The blonde noted that Jiro was not in a good mood today and asked the girl if her cut hurt much, and then closed her eyes, wet with tears, mentioning how hard it was for her to lose her husband. The touched maid looked at her mistress with tears of gratitude and love. Later, the maids discussed what had happened among themselves, noting that it was very difficult for the lady, as was Jiro. One of the girls said that it was the first time she saw the mistress in such a state. Guinevere stood under the door and heard the girl telling the others that the mistress had taken care of her hands. Walking along the corridor, the blonde realized that this was not enough, because the maids were not stupid children. There was a knock on the door of the estate, and a servant opened it, asking who had arrived. The gray-haired older man replied that he was a notary who had come because of the death of the Duke of Bright. He took a scroll out of his jacket pocket, looking at the servant. The man explained that he had come to convey Arthur Bright's last wishes to his widow. Guinevere received the notary in an office framed in rich dark blue, gold trim, and other decorative elements. The notary expressed his sincere condolences to the young woman. Blonde thanked him for his kind words, looking around with an interested gaze. The conversation between the two people turned to the will that Duke Arthur left behind. The gray-haired man handed Guinevere an envelope and said that Duke Bright had left a statement that he was transferring all powers to his wife. The girl took the scroll while the notary continued to talk and say that the will was written by the Duke after the wedding ceremony. The blonde unrolled the scroll, reading the familiar handwriting. She noticed that there was no seal under Arthur's signature, although he had always left one before. Guinevere immediately remembered her past life, in which Arthur's mother took away her inheritance under the pretext of caring. Then she and Jiro took advantage of her condition and soon began to handle all financial issues themselves. The girl recalled how they deceived her and insisted that she was too weak from grief and could not take on her husband's powers. Guinevere clarified that in his will, Arthur left all powers and titles to her, and the notary confirmed this. The will stated that Guinevere assumed full powers only until her daughter Sally came of age, but since she died, the widow became the rightful heir. Blonde asked if she could count on the support of a notary if questions arose, and he agreed. Afterwards, the notary added that Arthur bequeathed to her to do only what she considered necessary. The man mentally noted that it was he who introduced Arthur and Guinevere, and although he knew that everything would be all right, he never imagined that it would be this good. The girl invited him to stay for a few days to rest. Afterwards, she asked him to postpone the official announcement of the will, saying that she needed to put her thoughts in order. She attributed it to unfinished business, as well as the problems of the mistress and Jiro. Guinevere sipped her tea and asked if it would be difficult to transport her husband's body to the monastery. The man asked if she minded this, and the girl agreed. The gray-haired man stood up and bowed, promising that he would take Arthur's body to the monastery, and the girl advised him to rest before that. Later, the pensive Guinevere sat at the table and thought about everything that was happening around her. Thinking about Jiro and the lady, about the estate and what to do with it, she sighed loudly, and the maid asked if she was all right. The girl put a pink cup of hot tea with dried chrysanthemum and honey in front of her. She explained that it perfectly calms, and Guinevere, thanking the maid, sipped the drink with pleasure. The girl lowered her gaze and said that she had no right to console her mistress, but she should be sure that the Duke had gone to a better place. Such conversations were emotional, and bitter tears appeared in Joan's eyes. Guinevere suggested that she go and relax and not worry, but this moved the girl even more. Seeing Joan's tears, the blonde handed her her white scarf with beautiful floral embroidery. In a fit of emotion, the maid fell to her knees in front of her mistress and hugged her. Guinevere also wanted to cry, but tears were not a luxury for her. She could only console the unfortunate girl. The next day, Guinevere continued to think through the details of her plan, as well as managing the huge estate. Her quiet, leisurely morning was interrupted by the screams of Jiro, who burst into the office. The blonde didn't even look up from the documents, noting that the young man was being too loud, and this angered him even more. Jiro clenched his fist when the girl said she was ashamed of him and his behavior. His voice trembling and his tone mocking and arrogant, he said that he had heard something absolutely ridiculous. It turned out that the young man found out that Guinevere had moved his brother's grave. In a rage, he waved his hand, sweeping documents off the table. The girl calmly asked how he knew about this, but Jiro hit the table and demanded to know where she had moved Arthur. The blonde girl was calmer than ever. She expressed regret that they arrived earlier than they should have, teasing the young man. She slammed the cup down on the table and reminded Jiro that he had forgotten something. Guinevere spoke quietly, but stoically, mentioning that she had inherited all the powers of her husband's title. The young man leaned over her desk and called her trash, again blaming Arthur for his death. But now the girl only told him to knock next time and wait for permission before entering. Jiro froze, looking at her with wide eyes, and asked what she said. Guinevere called the maid and ordered to take the young man and his mother to Swansea, because he did not like the previous trip. The maids approached Jiro. "I'm going to carry out the mistress's order." Suddenly, the young man again showed his acting skills, calling the girl his sister in a breaking voice. He cried loudly, covering his face with his hands, and began to beg to tell him where his brother's grave was. Continuing the performance in front of the maids, Jiro fell to his knees, clutching Guinevere's dress with his hands. She quietly called him, took his face in her hands, and asked him to get up quickly, noting that his words were full of pain. Jiro stood up, and the girl whispered that her husband had a decent grave, and he shouldn't worry about it. Turning on her heels, the blonde headed to the table, ordering the maids to take the young man away. Her husband's brother was a skilled manipulator, and therefore continued to call her sister and beg. Guinevere was silent, and Jiro had no more ideas, except one. He grabbed the blade from its sheath and put it to his throat, forcing the girl to pay attention to him. The maids froze in fear, covering their beloved mistress, because they did not know what to expect from the angry young man. Guinevere walked around them, fearlessly standing in front of Jiro. She had gone through too much to now be afraid of an ordinary blade in the wrong hands. She pressed herself close to the young man and put her hand on his shoulder, telling him not to try to harm himself, because then it would be difficult to clean up after him. The blonde continued to whisper in his ear that it was dangerous for her to contradict, and Jiro asked if she expected obedience. Guinevere smiled and whispered quietly, but clearly that bright manner would disappear into darkness forever. Jiro was shocked by her words, and the servants, taking advantage of this confusion, took the young man away by the arms. Until the door slammed shut, he shouted something and struggled, but his pleas went unheard. When silence fell, Guinevere exhaled and rested her palms on the table, looking at the prepared scrolls and knowing that when Jiro returned, there would be nothing here. Meanwhile, in the corridor, the young man demanded that the maid let him go. Later, not getting what he wanted, he rushed forward, and the maid almost fell from this movement. Jiro assured them that he would go on his own, and it was time for them to stop going with him. The maids could not argue. They only watched as the brother of their dead master left. Guinevere's words about the estate, about obedience, and much more were spinning in the young man's head, and he, unable to withstand the tension, hit the wooden door with his fist. He threw his head up, swaying and muttering that he would still make her regret everything she had done. The next day, the Marquis of Wheefield received a letter from the Bright estate. The Marquis thoughtfully put his fist to his chin, clarifying whether Lady Guinevere had set such conditions, and his servant nodded. The man rose from his seat and said that he needed to see Mrs. Bright as soon as possible, and the servant politely replied that he was preparing the carriage. A few days later, the Bright estate was surrounded by sunlight, and the window frescoes sparkled as the rays hit it. Jiro and his mother returned from their trip. They did not look very happy, but did not express their hostility from the doorway. Guinevere met them and suggested they have dinner first, since they were most likely hungry. She led them into an elegantly decorated dining room with a table already set, ignoring the displeased faces. Guinevere invited them to sit down with a slight smile, already anticipating a fun feast. Jiro and his mother sat down at the table and the young man wondered if the blonde was trying to apologize for kicking him out. The girl was too smiling and pleased. She asked them to start eating so that the dishes they brought would not get cold. Today she gave them one last dinner, paying tribute to her departed husband. Having tried the fish, Jiro's mother grimaced and called the food disgusting. She said that she was tired of this dish back in Swansea and was not going to eat it here again. Guinevere listened silently to the reproaches of the woman and Jiro. The young man indulged his mother and grimaced, trying to remember if they had eaten anything like that before. Guinevere slammed the table and said that the food did not suit both of them. Jiro told her that he would eat lamb, but the blonde, with feigned frustration, said that now no one on the estate could cook it for them. Answering questions, Guinevere propped her face on her fist and declared that she had dismissed all the cooks. During the interruption, mother and son began pointing out to her that she could cook their food herself. The girl stood up and said that she did not understand what they were hinting at. She walked along the table and collected their plates of half-eaten food, ignoring the objections. Guinevere smiled, saying that if dinner arrived at 7 and was not to your liking, then everything should be cleared away. She looked calm and sweet as she prepared to take the collected plates to the kitchen. Jiro's mother was angry. She shouted at the girl in displeasure, trying to understand what her behavior would entail. When the old woman shouted at her, demanding to bring new food, the girl involuntarily remembered the days of that distant past life when her relatives mocked her with all their might. Then Guinevere was completely different and could not fight them back. She did not understand why she had to cook if there were chefs on the estate. At the time, Jiro was teasing her and asking if she shouldn't know how to cook. The blonde girl silently endured their humiliation, bowing her head. But she wasn't going to do that anymore. She calmly replied that they needed to prepare their own food. She touched the collected plates with her fingers and said that this was, in fact, their last meal at the estate. Confident and stoic, Guinevere straightened her shoulders and said that if they had finished eating, then it was time for them to leave the estate. She explained to the stunned mother and son that the entire Bright domain would soon come under Whitfield's control, including the manor, estate, and title. Jiro slammed the table, shouting that no one wanted such an outcome. Guinevere smiled brightly, touching her lip with her fingers, and objected that it was precisely this development that she needed. The young man loomed over her, shouting angrily that she had no right to dispose of the land as she pleased. The blonde one took out her husband's will and said that all this was left for her and she could do whatever she wanted. Jiro looked at the piece of paper in confusion, unable to believe what was happening. He shouted that his brother was not that kind of person and could not leave such a will. Grabbing Guinevere by the shoulder, he declared that he would not leave here, and in response, he heard that in this case, she would be forced to force him to do it. Jiro grabbed the neck of the bottle with his palm and hit the oak table with a flourish. The fragments scattered in different directions, along with splashes of expensive red wine, staining the carpet and table. Guinevere called the guards and ordered the violent young man to be escorted out. Jiro screamed and struggled, but could not do anything against the strong hands of the guards, who were holding him very tightly. Ignoring the young man's cries, Guinevere folded her palms on her chest, saying that Arthur was everything to her, and now she had become his worthy heir. She looked at Jiro with piercing eyes and reminded him that going against her will was very dangerous and inadvisable. The young man continued to kick and asked her if she really thought she could get away with all this. Guinevere did not respond to Jiro's provocations and exhaled deeply when the door slammed behind the guards and left her in silence. Hard times awaited him, but the bright sun that illuminated the estate seemed to show that the cruel man deserved such measures. Later, Guinevere was sorting through documents in the office she had already fallen in love with. She was distracted by a knock on the door, and then the butler Thomas entered, notifying her of the arrival of the guests and saying that Jiro and Mrs. McFadden had gone to their relatives living nearby. That relative was Uncle Jiro, a greedy and insatiable man. After this news was announced, the butler said that he would take her to the reception room to meet the arrival. A young man with violet-colored hair greeted the girl and said that he had not seen her for a long time. Guinevere responded hospitably to the arriving guest. He was Jean Barrett Whitfield, a man who played an important role in Arthur's life and was trustworthy. It was for this reason that the girl decided to sell him the estate at a favorable price. Guinevere touched the edge of the cup of hot tea with her fingers and asked him why he had come in person if she had sent him all the necessary documents. Mr. Whitfield replied that nothing bad had happened, but he wanted to make some amendments to their agreement himself. He clarified that in general, he would like to change everything that was discussed, and then said that he had heard about Duke Bright and understands that the girls have a hard time. Mr. Whitfield stated that preserving the estate of his old friend interested him more than any benefit, and Guinevere lostly asked if the price she proposed was too low and he wanted to change it. The young man agreed and said that she should take a profitable share for herself, because these properties are worth it. The blonde looked down and muttered in embarrassment whether this was comfort or advice. Mr. Whitfield replied that none of this was the case, and therefore they decided to renegotiate the terms of this deal. Guinevere knew that the man would not allow her to leave with nothing, and therefore she said that he would have to try hard to give her a large sum. He looked at her a little surprised, not expecting this, but replied that he was completely attentive. The girl briefly told him about her plan, said that she wanted to run away and live for herself, and therefore just take care of her servants. Mr. Whitfield bowed and pressed his hand to his chest, promising that she had nothing to worry about and that he was ready to protect them. 4 days later, Guinevere wrote a letter to the palace about Arthur's death, and that she was renouncing her title, and also decided to donate part of the money she received from the Whitfields to the church. She went straight there, but at first they refused to accept such a lot of money. Guinevere asked to take all these funds and spend some on Liam for her husband and daughter. The man promised her that he would take care of it, and also nodded politely when he realized that the young lady was going to leave somewhere. The blonde smiled and wished him happiness, glad that he agreed to accept the money. She stepped out onto the spacious terrace, looking around the majestic garden and realizing that she was going to leave this place in the past forever. Guinevere remembered how she spent time with her husband and daughter on these very lawns, and her heart responded with pain. The foundation of their relationship was not love, but trust and friendship. But now Arthur was no longer there, and as he bequeathed, the girl did what she wanted. She left the estate, saying goodbye forever to the majestic arches of luxurious buildings and towers. But looking back, she had no regrets, and knew that she would never want to return. Guinevere recalled that long ago she was the princess of the kingdom of Leongrass, surrounded by the love of loved ones and living in peace and quiet. But when she was 6 years old, war broke out on the continent, and the entire kingdom was destroyed. Guinevere's memories of those times were very blurred and inaccurate. She only remembered how someone was chasing her nanny while she was carrying her in her arms through the dark forest. Stopping, the nanny put her on the ground and said that she would have to go further on her own, and if she moved in a certain direction, she would reach the White Castle. Guinevere grabbed her nanny's cape with her fingers and asked her to go along. She replied that she would soon catch up with her, but for now they needed to separate, and ran away in the other direction. This was the last time the young princess saw her beloved nanny Una, who saved her life by becoming a bait for the military. Thanks to the nanny, Guinevere managed to get to Glastonbury Abbey, where she was accepted and allowed to stay. In this warm and calm place, she once met her love, a guy from the past, who has now become just a fragment of memories. Guinevere thought about Gero and how tough he was. She thought that even if Gero tried to steal her title and make her a commoner, he would absolutely find a way to manipulate her no matter what, so she needed to find a quiet place where she could settle down and forget about all problems. The girl exhaled and smiled, anticipating her future. Fortunately, Guinevere found a cozy and safe home in which she could feel comfortable. She walked down the street in a warm winter coat and thought about how cold it was in the capital, warming her palms with her warm breath. More than 3 months passed, and Guinevere continued to live in a 2-story house located in a sunny location next to the city market. And even though she didn't have her own garden or yard in her new house, she built a small vegetable garden inside. She planted a plant that had been recommended to her as a good luck tree, and it seemed to be starting to bloom. This plant purifies the air, and according to legend, it was blessed by fairies and will bloom only on lucky days. Guinevere thought about how her former relatives were going crazy and were most likely looking for her everywhere, but she planned to kill them first. The girl walked away from her plants and thought that if Gero began to use his uncle's influence, sooner or later he would find her. The man was a greedy man who would do anything for money, and Guinevere had no intention of becoming his victim. She went outside to do some shopping and met her neighbor, Madame Harry. They agreed to go together and went to the city market. One of the most popular were public ovens, in which bread was baked for people who brought flour. There were a lot of people near this place, because the bread prepared here was cheaper than that sold in bakeries. Madame Harry said that her daughter Sophie was embarrassed every time she saw a worker at the public oven, and Guinevere was surprised at this. The neighbor added that her daughter cries for him so many times that it is impossible to count. Meanwhile, their turn came, and the young worker was really handsome. People were attracted by his dark skin and dark hair and eyebrows. He asked them to give him the flour, took the heavy bag, and told them to wait a little. Madame Harry asked Guinevere if she was alone here, to which the girl agreed. And while they were talking, the bread was baked, and the worker gave it to the women. A neighbor asked the blonde girl if she was lonely, but she replied that her husband had recently died. Madame Harry hurriedly asked for forgiveness, and a small boy with red hair ran past them. While the women were talking, the boy cupped his hands like a bullhorn and shouted that the war was over. Liberators, warriors dressed in knightly armor, entered the city, and all the residents greeted them with joyful shouts and applause. Guinevere noted that the knights were riding towards the palace, but her companion suddenly dropped the bread and shouted the name Zlayton. The woman rushed to the young man, who was her son, who returned alive. The fair-haired one watched the happiness of the people around her and remembered how Lancelot asked him not to forget. She closed her eyes and reminded herself that it was a long time ago. All this was left somewhere there, when she thought that the boy would grow up and they would spend the rest of their lives together. Guinevere turned around and was about to leave, but suddenly the company of soldiers stopped. Their leader dismounted from his horse and went straight to the girl. She froze in amazement, trying to squeeze out a word. The unknown man pulled off his helmet with a soft but quick movement of his hand. Hair appeared from under the metal plate, playfully sparkling and silvering in the sun. Before Guinevere really stood Lancelot, who, as it seemed before, had turned from a real person into a memory that one day slipped away forever. The fair-haired woman looked at the stretched-out man in disbelief and could not believe that here he was, alive, standing in front of her. Lancelot looked at her, whispering his favorite name, as if warming his lips. Not expecting this meeting, the girl felt fright and shame, and therefore turned sharply and walked in the opposite direction. The man froze, hearing the enthusiastic screams of the crowd around him, but feeling an unpleasant cold throughout his body. Guinevere ran into the alley and stopped, trying to catch her breath, lost from such an unexpected meeting with a long-forgotten love. She did not expect that Lancelot would follow her and have time to catch up. He changed, became stronger and taller. His voice lost its teenage brittleness and pitch, and he said that he had finally found her. Guinevere was covered in goosebumps. She looked lost and scared. Lancelot stepped towards her and took her hand, asking her to talk about everything in another place. She still couldn't believe what was happening and that she could talk to him again as before, and therefore, struggling with emotions, she wanted to leave again. Lancelot wanted to touch her cheek, but she caught his hand, not knowing whether her heart could withstand the tremulous touch of long-forgotten hands. The man said that he understood that a lot of time had passed, and this explained her behavior. Guinevere called him a raw knight, and in response to his surprise, replied that she did not know the name, and it would be better to address him that way. Lancelot felt a prick of unpleasant and slippery pain. He again felt like a little boy who could not squeeze out a word at the sight of his beloved girl. The blonde explained that too much time had passed since their last meeting. Everything had changed and became much more complicated. Lancelot nodded in understanding, but they were interrupted by the cries of the soldiers who had lost their captain and did not want to celebrate the victory without him. Guinevere's hands trembled and grew cold, and he noticed it immediately. Unexpectedly for her, he clicked the clasp of his warm, formal cloak, removing it from his shoulders. Lancelot said that it was cold today, and her hands were icy, and threw his thing over her fragile shoulders. He pulled her hand to his cheek and said that he was aware of his guilt that she felt hurt, and then added that the days without her were long, and he constantly regretted how he treated her and swore that he was more than her. Won't lose. Turning around, he gave the command to the soldiers to go forward, and they immediately listened to him. Sitting at home and clutching her warm and pleasantly smelling cloak with her palms, Guinevere thought about what had happened. It was not her fault that she did not wait for Lancelot, because circumstances decided everything for her. When she reached adulthood, the monastery said that they could not take care of her forever, and the only option was an agreement with Arthur Bright. She did not want to do something like this, but that year was difficult for the monastery. Finances were running out, and therefore the girl agreed to the marriage and, with her decision, saved the rest of the orphans from hunger. Guinevere remembered the tattered letter from Lancelot, and also mentally noted that the envelope was torn. She froze in fear and thought that the letter could have been replaced. The girl remembered how Jiro threw her an envelope and asked why she was receiving such a letter. She realized that then he was definitely hiding something. He always lied to her, every day, at every opportunity, and in every possible way. Guinevere thought about the reasons for such actions, but decided that she would no longer waste time on this and smiled, getting up from her seat. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door from a neighbor, and the girl let her in, asking Madame Harry what happened. The woman explained that she wanted to attend a festival in the city. The girl replied that the whole continent was probably celebrating now, and Madame Harry said that the local lords paid special attention to this festival and suggested they have fun together. But Guinevere asked why the woman did not want to spend time with her son and not with her. Madame Harry explained that her son was scared by the fireworks, which made her upset and decided to go to the festival. But the girl advised her to spend time with her son and take care of him. The woman responded with gratitude and said that she would rather cook her son his favorite baked duck, and then said goodbye to her neighbor and left. Guinevere decided to go to the festival herself and walked into the square filled with joyful people. She was called out near a meat snack shop, and the girl decided to approach. At the seller's suggestion, the blonde girl tried a piece of hot meat that had recently been removed from the spit. After chewing, she suddenly screamed and coughed from the sharpness. The seller asked for forgiveness, but Guinevere chuckled slightly and smiled at the pleasant aftertaste, noting that after such a shock, all the worries faded into the background. She did not listen to the seller's objections and left him several gold coins as gratitude. Suddenly, the girl heard a herald informing everyone about a performance that would tell everyone about the hero thanks to whom this war was won. Guinevere froze, wondering if Lancelot could be the hero of the war, because the soldiers called him captain, and his blue eyes were full of wisdom and determination. She hesitated a little, but stood in line with the gathered people. Suddenly, an unfamiliar man stepped forward. The woman standing behind Guinevere indignantly asked him what he was doing, and the guy replied that he did not understand what he was talking about. He turned to the blonde and asked her to confirm that he had a place in line. Guinevere objected and replied that this was not so, and he needed to take his place. Two guards approached them and said that both the man and two women needed to leave because they were all making a noise. The unfamiliar girl rudely answered the guard that she was not going to go anywhere. They tried to insist, but Guinevere asked them if they really didn't see what happened, and then defended the girl, saying that if so, she would leave alone. The guards spoke among themselves, moving slightly towards each other. In the end, they decided to leave the girls alone, but drive away the cunning guy. After exchanging thanks with the stranger, Guinevere went to the house and sat down on a bench, enjoying the silence and air. She realized that she didn't want to return home now and preferred to take a walk. The girl wanted to visit her neighbor, but she didn't open the door, so she moved on. Approaching her house, Guinevere saw a familiar figure at the door. Lancelot heard footsteps and turned to her, and then stepped several times to get closer. He touched her hand in greeting, feeling his heart skip a few beats due to his proximity to his beloved. In the moonlight, his hair looked even more beautiful, and his voice seemed lower and hoarse. He almost whispered her full name. Guinevere froze in front of him, unable to take her eyes off his face. Lancelot put his hand on her neck and said that he had come to see her, but it was already late for him to go. He added that they would have a lot of time to talk later, and then said that he had been having a hard time, sat on his knee and muttered that if he caused her any inconvenience, he would leave. Lancelot took her fragile palm with his large hands, stroking the velvet skin. He bowed his head and touched her hand with a tender kiss. He then looked up and asked if she thought he was weird. For Guinevere, too much time had passed. She asked him to let go of his hand because she felt unpleasant. But in fact, she felt the weight of those events that left a mark on her. Lancelot stood up and asked if she was trying to escape from him again. The girl replied that she had never done this, and then added that she was just tired of waiting so long. The man tried to object and say that he was also waiting, but the blonde girl interrupted him. She said that everything that happens is the consequences of her own choice. After the words were spoken, she turned around and invited him to find a more convenient place to talk. The girl headed forward along the dark alley, and Lancelot followed her. They silently arrived at a cafe familiar to Guinevere, where the waitress immediately recognized her and said hello. Lancelot walked next to her, and from the outside they seemed like a completely harmonious couple. The waitress asked about the handsome man with whom her guest came, but the fair-haired woman replied that he was just an acquaintance. After a while, they were already sitting at the table with a cup of hot tea and delicious English muffins. Lancelot said that, contrary to his assumption, everything was going well for Guinevere, and the girl asked if there was any reason not to move on. The man smiled slightly, but looked sad, and then shook his head and whispered that she was right. The girl asked him why he wanted to see each other, and added that it was probably not childhood memories that brought him to her. Lancelot took an envelope from his pocket and handed it to her, answering that he received it when he arrived on the battlefield. Guinevere opened the envelope and took it out, beginning to read the letter. In the text, she allegedly asked him not to send any more letters because she was marrying the Duke of Bright. The handwriting in which the letters were written reminded her of Jiro's handwriting. The girl was surprised and shocked. She said that she did not write this letter, and that it was written and sent a year before her wedding. Lancelot lowered his head and said that in war neither allies nor enemies can hide. All people die. But what scared him most was not death. Guinevere wondered how long she had been deceived, and then stood up and said that she knew why he had come. but now she could not give the answer that he expected. She looked at him and said that their relationship had ended a long time ago, but she wanted to leave it as fond memories, and then she turned around and headed out. Lancelot called out to her, left alone with his thoughts and worries. He stood up and asked if he could tell the rest tomorrow, and Guinevere, already leaving, let out a quiet agreement. In the morning, the girl stretched and couldn't even remember how she got home. She stood up and opened the curtains because she heard the sound of wheels driving along the cobblestones. A carriage stopped near her house, and a stranger got out. The girl went out onto the porch, and it turned out that Ridmond, a servant sent by the Armork family from which Lancelot came, had come to her. Guinevere went to the castle of the Armork family, and even though she was afraid of some things, she promised herself to remain strong no matter the outcome. She was met at the castle by a servant named Eugenia, who took the girl to Lancelot. A familiar voice was heard from behind the heavy oak doors, allowing entry. The blonde crossed the threshold of the room, painted in red, gold, and black, and saw Lancelot sitting on the sofa. He stood up and apologized for calling the girl so early, but explained that he wanted to see her as soon as possible. The man gently squeezed her hand and said that he had a serious conversation. He sat Guinevere down on the sofa and asked her to listen carefully. Lancelot said that he was the last bearer of his surname, and while he was at war, the butler was responsible for the affairs of his family, and then invited the girl to become the head of the family. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he thought this proposal was too strange in their situation. Guinevere thought that before coming here, she was going to use her once loved one for her own purposes, but she no longer wanted to. Suddenly, Lancelot interrupted her thoughts, and shocking the girl, pronounced Jiro's full name. He explained that he used to often work with Duke Bright's younger brother, and said that he could help her solve some problems, and even agreed for her to use him for her own purposes. Guinevere was silent, looking at the man in amazement, and mentally asking questions about how he knew about Jiro, and how much he knew in general. A quiet bell rang, distracting them from their conversation, and Lancelot explained that it was time for lunch, and then invited her to join him. The girl stood up and said that she could not yet give an exact answer to his proposal, but she would try to solve everything as soon as possible. Lancelot nodded and replied that he would send someone for her again tomorrow afternoon. He silently watched as the girl left, closing the heavy doors behind her. A little later they brought him lunch, consisting of several large dishes. Lancelot replied that the guest had already left, and this food would be enough for him alone, so he could divide it among all the workers. At the same time, Evgenia announced that she had prepared a carriage for the girl, and she thanked her. Eugenia looked after Lancelot since childhood. She remembered with what trepidation he looked forward to meeting the then little Guinevere. The maid bowed to the girl and said that she would be glad to see her in the future. Ridmond met her in surprise at the carriage and asked why she did not stay for lunch. The girl explained that she needed to return because of urgent business and got into the carriage. On the way home, she thought about what had happened, and upon arrival, Ridmond helped her get out of the carriage. They talked politely to each other, and suddenly the guy asked to listen to him, and then started talking about Lancelot, who was changed by the war and the events that depended on it. Ridmond said that shortly after the start of the war, the Duke's ancestor died, followed by his wife. Young Lancelot, who inherited everything, became a target for rumors and gossip. The previous Duke took revenge on him for unknown reasons, and because of this he was sent to the front lines. Every day he became more and more immersed in himself. His smile became a rare occurrence. Ridmond noted that when speaking about Guinevere, Lancelot became joyful and happy. The servant hoped that his story would help the girl overcome her doubts, and then wished her a good rest, got into the carriage and left. The thoughtful girl went to the house, but realized that she could not sit quietly and decided to take a walk. Soon she was called by Madame Harry, who asked if everything was okay, because she saw the carriage arriving in the morning. The woman squeezed Guinevere's hands, but she convinced her that everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. The girl saw an interesting pendant from her neighbor, and she hastened to explain that it was a necklace of wishes, and she bought it so that her son, Zlatan, would be safe. Guinevere asked where Madame Harry bought the chain, and she replied that she found this beauty from a street vendor in the square. Having said goodbye, the girl went to the square in order to find something interesting for herself. In that same shop, one of the decorations reminded her of the flower that fell from Lancelot's bouquet on the day they met. A bright yellow flower hung on a long chain, just like a real one. The girl took the chain in her hands, but suddenly a stranger shouted at her, demanding that she give the jewelry to him. The slightly puzzled blonde replied that she saw no point in shouting so loudly, but the man replied that he definitely needed to buy jewelry. The seller intervened in the quarrel. He called the man Hans and asked him to stop the booth. Despite the salesman's efforts, Hans continued to shout at the girl. Minerva called him insane and advised him to stop being so stubborn. People in the square began to turn around. Some whispered and said that the famous drunkard had caused a scandal again. Hearing this, Hans turned around and walked away, and the seller hastened to apologize to the girl. He said that Hans was a good person, but in the war he injured his leg, and he had no one left except his mother, but even she died. After paying for the chain, Guinevere decided to talk to Hans. She walked forward along the square and, lost in thought, almost collided with a handsome red-haired man. Having passed him, she continued on her way and finally caught up with Hans. The girl showed Hans the pendant and asked who it was intended for. The man asked in surprise why she was interested in this, and the blonde told him her story, explaining why the pendant attracted her. Suddenly, Hans said that this flower was similar to the one his mother loved when she was alive, and he wanted to take it to her gravestone. Guinevere said that in this case, he can take the pendant and his mother will definitely like it. Hans was embarrassed and asked why she was giving him this thing, but the girl smiled and replied that she was doing it simply because she wanted to. She handed him the chain, and the man, hesitantly, accepted her gift. The girl wished him a good day and left, leaving him alone to struggle with embarrassment and gratitude. Guinevere was approaching the house when she noticed a crowd of people gathered nearby. A neighbor came out to meet her, anxiously asking if something had happened to her. Their conversation, which had not yet begun, was interrupted by an unfamiliar man approaching. He looked at Guinevere and compared her face with the image in the small drawing. After this, the man called her full name from the royal family, according to which the girl should be held accountable for renouncing her title without imperial consent. The guards took her by the arms and led her away, but this was taken into account in her plan. The blonde thought that if she agreed to Lancelot's proposal, then she would own enormous wealth and title, but they would also bear responsibility and obligations. The girl was brought to the luxurious imperial palace, which was full of bright decorations, interesting solutions by architects and artists, and also amazed the imagination with the number of rooms and long corridors. The escort said that the crown prince was entrusted with this matter, and the girl should meet with him. Suddenly, on the porch of the palace, Guinevere saw Giro, who again called her sister. She said that in the current relationship, it was not appropriate for him to call her that. Continuing to act out the performance, Giro extended his hands to her and said that he was incredibly glad to see her and that he missed her very much. He leaned closer to her and asked where she was and what she was doing, and then said that he had been looking for her for a long time. The escort asked them to end the conversation quickly. The girl looked at Giro's fake tears and thought that he hadn't changed a bit, and then she took his face in her hands and said that if he wants to get the title, he shouldn't worry about the rumors that surround him. The young man's eyes widened, and he asked how she knew about this, to which the girl advised him not to forget that the people around him were watching him. She turned around and headed towards the escort, who was already waiting for her. In parting, she said that it was time for her to go and that they would meet later, if possible. After being allowed to enter, the girl came face to face with the crown prince, a young man with pleasant blonde hair and sparkling brown eyes. She greeted him and came closer. The prince said that he did not know how to organize their meeting, and pointed the girl to the prepared chair, in which she carefully sat down. The young man told her that he had received news from the emperor, to whom Giro arrived, and reported that she had acted unfairly. The girl replied that Giro and Mrs. McFadden simply could not come to terms with the fact that Arthur bequeathed everything to her. He listened carefully to Guinevere, who said that she only wanted to respect the will of her deceased husband, and then replied that he would convey this to the king, and their meeting is over. The blonde said that it was an honor for her to meet the crown prince, and then she slipped out of the office and began to think about how she needed to stop Giro from building friendships with such people. She was again met by an escort who asked her to follow him. Guinevere remembered her past life and how the prince asked her to join her, said that she was so difficult to protect, and he loved her more than anyone else. Then her brother's husband saw and heard all this. He caught the girl in the corridor and demanded to know why she was with the crown prince yesterday, and she could only deny and try to justify herself. After the incident, Giro handed her the dessert and told her to take it to a man she didn't even know. Guinevere obeyed, but a little later discovered that the man had lost his creation after eating the dessert. During the conversation, Giro directly admitted that he did it, and the girl understood that everything that happened then was due to her ignorance. At the exit from the castle, a stranger approached her and said that Giro would visit her later. Thanking the man, Guinevere walked into the carriage. On the way home, the girl thought that her dead husband's brother was planning to gain the trust of the prince, and he could become his reliable supporter, which means that the worse their relationship becomes, the better it will be for her. Having finally reached home, the blonde thanked the escort and asked him to be careful on the way back. The next day, Lancelot was again waiting for the girl at his place. Evgenia brought her and bowing left. The young people greeted each other again. Lancelot warned the girl that His Highness would join them, and she could stay if she wanted. After that, he approached her a little and asked for forgiveness for the rash act he had done last time. He said that he should have spoken thoughtfully and taken into account everything that was happening now. The girl asked him not to worry about it. She then said that other things were making it difficult for her to accept his offer right now. Lancelot nodded and said that if she ever needed help, she could always turn to him. They started talking about how exactly Lancelot found out about Gero, but they were interrupted. After the servant's announcement, the doors opened, and a pleasant red-haired man entered the room. The Duke greeted the young man, who turned out to be the second son of the Emperor named Gawain. Guinevere bowed her head, saying that she was honored to meet him, and then asked forgiveness for not recognizing him when she met him on the street. The prince reassured her and decided to formally introduce himself. He said that his name was Gawain Dave Crimson Dean. After the greetings, Lancelot asked if Gawain would like to continue the conversation over food, and he agreed. This time, Guinevere could not refuse dinner, because her friend's guest was, albeit a junior, but a prince. They all sat down in the huge dining room, where the table had already been set for them. Gawain praised the cook for the delicious food, and said that he could come to him if he needed work. The servants left, and the prince said that he could see in the girl's eyes that she had many questions. He chewed a piece of meat, and with a smile asked if Lancelot should have told about this in the first place, to which he replied that His Highness had interrupted them with his arrival. Gawain told Guinevere that he learned about her situation from his father, and Gero said that he wanted at least a small place in the huge household, which is why the girl immediately stopped smiling. Afterwards, the prince said that he had been deceived by this cunning man and sipped the wine, and then asked whether the rumors were true that said that Miss Pugh could have suffered from the actions of Gero. The girl raised her glass of wine and answered without further ado that she suffered a lot because of the brother of her deceased husband. Lancelot froze upon hearing this, his gaze fixated on the blonde beauty. The prince joked that at that moment, the Duke seemed to have become a dumb stone statue. He hastily replied that he was simply worried about the guests who had arrived, to which Gawain uttered another joke. It seemed that they were close friends. After this, the prince said that he would always be on Guinevere's side if she ever needed help, but Lancelot noted that this was too much, and the girl agreed with him. Gawain said that he was not close to his father anyway, and was unlikely to be too influential, which made Lancelot look at him with worry. The girl thought that the place of crown prince was firmly assigned to the first son of the emperor, but, on reflection, she concluded that Gawain could play his role, and therefore said that she would definitely turn to him if something happened. A little later, Lancelot and Guinevere escorted the prince to his carriage. The young people discussed the dinner a little among themselves, noting the wonderful atmosphere. The Duke smiled and asked the girl for permission to take her home. He squeezed her soft hand, smiling. Afterwards, Lancelot helped Guinevere climb into the carriage and sit on the soft seats, upholstered in soft material. The girl tried not to stare at him, while the Duke tirelessly watched his long-loved facial features. Finally deciding to break the silence, she asked what kind of relationship Lancelot had with Gawain, and he explained that they were comrades on the battlefield. When the carriage stopped at Guinevere's house, the Duke exhaled and asked her not to trust anyone. Turning away, he added that now it is very difficult to distinguish lies from the truth. Lancelot got out first and helped the girl down. He offered her his hand, and Guinevere squeezed his fingers slightly, feeling her heart beat faster. The girl asked him to wait a little, and then brought out his cloak, which he had recently covered her shoulders on the street. Lancelot blushed, saying that he had already forgotten about it, but thanked the blonde. They said goodbye, and the Duke got into the carriage, heading back to the estate. Thinking about Lancelot's instructions, Guinevere realized that for a long time she had not trusted anyone but herself. She thought that now her old friend was known as a war hero, but he was firmly entrenched at court, which meant that he had to endure quite a few betrayals. The girl decided that she must offer the help that Gawain offered her at the decisive opportunity for her victory. At the same time, Uncle Gero shouted at him in the office, declaring that he should not have left even if his legs were torn off. He slammed the table, cutting off his nephew's objections. Gero silently endured his uncle's reprimands, knowing how much now depended on him. They quarreled because the young man could not follow the girl in front of everyone, and after that, Gero said that his uncle could easily find her if he asked around the capital about her. The uncle was angry that he could not receive the promised share of the inheritance, because Guinevere remained undetected, but Jiro promised that he would soon sort it out. His uncle waved his hand displeasedly, ordering him to leave. The young man obeyed, and going into the corridor, clenched his fists in anger, growling with indignation. In the capital, Madame Harry came to visit Guinevere and asked if she could call her neighbor simply Mrs. Pugh. The girl shook her head, saying that she could continue to call her by the old name. She did not trust the woman completely, but did not want to refuse communication with her, and therefore calmly accepted her excitement. Then they started talking about Madame's son Harry, and you smiled. She thanked Guinevere for the advice, saying that he gradually began to leave the room and get used to peaceful life. The girl smiled, saying goodbye to her neighbor after a short but emotional conversation, and closed the door behind her. Guinevere sat down in a chair and exhaled noisily. Lately, any conversation had been exhausting her. The girl did not have time to rest, because she was again disturbed by a knock on the door. The unexpected guest was the unwanted Jiro. Fighting the urge to slam the door, Guinevere smiled and said that she had not expected or invited anyone today. They exchanged barbs, and Jiro was feignedly surprised, asking if they hadn't told her about his visit. He stepped closer, crossing the threshold, and loomed over her, asking why he had to ask permission to come in the first place. Jiro tried again to blame the girl for all the troubles, but she decided to firmly defend herself and stated that she was not responsible for this. The young man, amazed at her calmness, shouted that she was to blame for the death of his brother, and she kicked him out with his mother. Trying to ignore the sting of pain from his words, Guinevere said that she had nothing more to say and asked him to leave. She almost closed the door, but was stopped by a servant. He came forward and gave the girl a letter from Uncle Jiro, and also said that he had ordered him to be polite and not allow his nephew to disturb the girl if something happened. Guinevere took the envelope, enjoying Jiro's lost look. She gratefully replied that she would definitely read the letter and hurried away, leaving the unexpected guests. The young man could not restrain himself and began to shout that she could not so easily ignore him and the truth that stung her eyes. Jiro shouted her name and rushed forward, but his uncle's servant deftly held the guy back, not allowing him to do anything stupid. Left alone with her thoughts, Guinevere thought that Jiro must not get along very well with his relative. She sat down at the table and opened the envelope, beginning to read the letter. Uncle Jiro wrote to her about his burning desire to help her overcome all her troubles, and this disgusted the girl. She finished reading the letter and stood up, resting her hands on the table, thinking that this man, as always, justifies his title of complete insignificance. Meanwhile, at the imperial palace, a servant was informing the crown prince of the amount of gold and salt that was planned to be delivered this month. After the report, the servant handed the prince a small hemisphere, saying that it had been given to the young man. The prince picked up a sphere resembling an eye and looked into it, seeing Jiro's acquaintance talking with Guinevere. The next picture of the iridescent sphere showed his satisfied, sweet face. The prince chuckled, saying that he thought Jiro was an obedient puppy, and then said that they could not use this jewel as a toy all the time. The servant reminded him that he would soon need to go to see His Majesty and wanted to leave, but the prince asked him to stay. A little later, the heir to the empire moved through the garden, accompanied by a servant and guards, indignant that they were constantly following him. As soon as the knights were assigned to him, he immediately began to feel uncomfortable. The prince distracted himself from these thoughts and said that when he arrives, the air is always refreshing. The servant rashly noted that soon this residence would belong to the prince. The young man shushed him angrily, ordering the servant to be careful with what he said. He dropped to one knee and asked the heir for forgiveness for his stupid words. The prince forgave him, patted him on the shoulder, and urged him not to make such mistakes in the future. And only the two of them knew that this mistake was not an accident, but a test. And now the prince was only wondering whether they would report this to the old man right away or not. The young man entered the chambers of his sick father and asked forgiveness for his lateness. The prince said that he had something to tell his father, and it would be about the Bright family. The emperor immediately perked up and asked if they had finally been able to find Guinevere. Listening to his son's story, the emperor rubbed his forehead with his hand and told him to bring Miss Pugh so that he could talk to her personally. The prince said that His Majesty's words were law for him, but their conversation was interrupted by Gawain suddenly appearing. He entered the chambers after permission and bowed to his father. The older brother looked at the younger brother contemptuously, without expressing much joy. His father praised Gawain for the way he completed a difficult task, and his brother hypocritically joined in the praise, while the red-haired prince only denied. They played their roles well, and the emperor noted that they got along well with each other. Even the father's well-being seemed to improve a little from the way his sons interacted with each other. At this point, the conversation was over, and the young people left their ruler so that he could rest, and all pleasantries between them were dispelled when the older brother ordered the younger to behave more quietly and below the grass. He left Gawain in his thoughts and walked further down the corridor. The Crown Prince told his servant Patrick that he needed to know more about the Bright family. Entering the room, the prince threw his red jacket on the floor. He exhaled and fell onto the bed, hiding his face in the crook of his elbow. The conversation between the men turned to the invited guest, and the prince rose to his feet, instructing Patrick in a threatening tone to be very polite. The next day, a carriage drove up to Guinevere's house again. Patrick came out and met the guest of honor, greeted her, and helped her get into the carriage. On the way, Patrick reminded the girl that in the presence of the emperor, she should always watch what she does and what she says, and the blonde thanked him for his advice. Guinevere was worried, because the memory of how the ruler assigned her a terrible execution was still clear. After some time, Patrick told her that she couldn't go further, she had to walk, and then he helped her get out of the carriage. Following him, the girl went into the palace, and then into the emperor's office. Guinevere bowed her head and greeted the monarch, introducing herself to him by her full name. She felt goosebumps on her back and legs as the memory of a terrible, burning iron bull and hellish pain consuming her entire body flashed brightly in her head. The girl was silent for too long, and so Patrick began to call her, urging her to answer the emperor. The monarch smiled good-naturedly and asked the girl not to worry so much. Guinevere sat down at the table and smiled slightly as the maid placed a cup of tea in front of her. The servants bowed to the emperor and retreated into the corridor, closing the doors. The emperor took a cup of tea and invited the girl to talk, and then expressed his condolences for the death of Arthur and said that the desire to sell the estate was quite natural, but noted that betraying the title was an unforgivable mistake. Guinevere collected her thoughts, looking at the emperor with fear and remorse. Exhaling, she said that His Majesty was completely right and that she admitted her mistake, and then spoke about her relationship with Jiro. The emperor hummed thoughtfully, mentally wondering how such a good boy could become like this. Guinevere once again repented of what she had done, and said that she would accept any decision of the monarch. Afterwards, they talked about the fact that the girl came from a monastery, and the ruler would like her to use the knowledge she acquired there for the benefit of the empire, or more precisely, to serve someone in the palace. With the emperor's permission, Gawain entered the office. The girl did not have time to be surprised, because the monarch fell onto the table with a crash, coughing. When the emperor began to cough up blood, Gawain cried out in fear if anyone was outside. The ruler hoarsely asked his son not to scream, saying that it would make his ears ring, and took a sip of medicine from a flask. The doctor came and said that the ruler should rest because he had been on his feet for too long. Guinevere said that health should come first and said goodbye to the outgoing emperor. Gawain hastened to explain that his father had left his chambers for the first time in a long time and was apparently overtired. Continuing the conversation for the emperor, Gawain blushed a little and told the girl that the emperor had instructed her to serve him, a close friend of Lancelot. The girl asked in surprise why she was chosen, and the prince replied that he would also like to know about it. Bowing her head, Guinevere said that she humbly accepted His Majesty's order, and at that time, she herself thought that she finally had a place in the palace. Gawain said that he would try to be careful so as not to harm her. She told him not to worry, and although such an order was unexpected, the emperor probably had a reason to entrust it to her. Having discussed everything, they got up from the table and left the office. At the same time, the crown prince spoke again to his servant Patrick, asking if the man was truly a close friend of the Duke of Armor, to which Patrick replied that the two were closest children. The crown prince said thoughtfully that if the Duke intervened, things would become more complicated. The prince thought intensely about everything that was happening, mentally repeating how much what was happening irritated him. Interrupting his thoughts, the maid entered the office and announced that she had completed the assignment. She approached the prince and whispered that due to His Majesty's health, the matter had been entrusted to Prince Gawain. The prince needed to be alone, and he said that Patrick could go. Left alone, the prince said his brother's name out loud, called him a good brother, and said that the period of resistance overtook him too late. Guinevere walked through the garden, holding the documents she had brought in her hands. Walking along the green corridor of plants, the girl followed the servant, and she was asked to wait for the master in a spacious room. A few minutes later, Uncle Jero entered the room, expressing feigned joy that they had finally met and sympathizing with the girl who had come a long way. The girl stood up and bowed to him, introducing herself. They sat down next to each other and began to discuss matters. Uncle Jero asked if it was good for him that the girl herself decided to visit him. Guinevere looked him over and said that she did not know, but noted that his proposal was interesting. They were distracted from the conversation by shouts from the corridor, where the servants tried to hold the young man, but he only shouted, provoking his uncle, who exhaled and said to let Jiro through. He walked into the room and snorted, saying he didn't understand why they wouldn't let him in. Looking at Guinevere with a smile, he said that they would have met anyway. Uncle asked Jiro not to interfere, but he shouted that he should decide. The man approached his nephew and said that now he is nothing without him, and everything in his life depends on his uncle's money. Turning away from Jiro, the man ordered him to quietly return to his place and not show such disrespect again. Jiro told his uncle that he would regret all this. Guinevere and Uncle Jiro looked gloomily after the departing young man, trying to collect their thoughts after his sharp attacks. Taking the topic away from the guy, the girl laid the envelope on the table. She clarified whether the man could really help her and where the limit of his help was. The surprised nobleman heard that Guinevere no longer wanted to have any connections with her deceased husband's brother and asked if they were really not family. Having received a negative answer, the man clarified exactly how he could help her. The girl said that she would like to send Jiro to rest in a quiet place, and in return offered him one of the remaining inheritances, and the man replied that Jiro would not cause her any inconvenience, his hands and voice trembling in anticipation of receiving wealth. Guinevere stood up and replied that he could rewrite the land in any name, and it was time for her to leave. The man saw her off with a smile and said that they would see each other next time. When the footsteps in the corridor died down, he pressed his hand against the door and laughed loudly, rejoicing at his success. Jiro stood at the window and watched Guinevere's carriage leaving the yard. Later, he resolutely walked towards his uncle's office. Passing by the maid standing nearby, he said that there was no way they could restrain him. He entered the office, loudly slamming the door and announcing his arrival. The uncle refused to tell his nephew what exactly he was talking about with Guinevere behind closed doors, and the young man again exploded with screams. The man ignored his hysteria and said that Jiro needed a vacation somewhere far away, and he responded in a trembling voice by asking what this sudden statement was. Continuing to silently ignore Jiro's circulation, his uncle waved his hand, ordering him to hide. The young man left the office, breathing heavily and clicking his heels on the marble floor. At the same time, in the imperial palace, Gawain sat over papers and worked. After knocking on the door and being allowed to enter, Guinevere came into his office, to whom he hurried to greet and ask if there were any problems on the road. The girl bowed and replied that she arrived comfortably and calmly. The prince pulled back his chair, silently inviting her to sit down. Having settled down opposite each other, they began to talk about how the first few days would be a period of getting used to life in the palace for the fair-haired one. After talking for a while, Gawain told her that difficult times might come, but she could always turn to him about it. Guinevere looked down and thanked the young prince for his concern. Then she got up from her seat and said that she would leave him, realizing that she had already taken a lot of his time. Gawain said that he had assigned a special assistant to her and then tried to sit down again to work, but his head was buzzing with extraneous thoughts. In the corridor, the servant met the girl, took her things, and led her forward to lead her to the allocated chambers. Walking along the corridor, Guinevere saw a familiar girl. The dark-haired woman smiled at her, and the girl responded in kind, mentally exhaling and rejoicing that in this life, Lady Florence was alive and did not become her victim. The servant showed her to the chambers and said that the room was a little dilapidated, but they tried to bring it to the best possible condition. Guinevere thanked him and was finally able to be alone with her thoughts. The estate garden was serene and quiet, glowing with calm. But then he was visited by an angry Jiro, speaking out loud about how unfairly he was being treated. His hands were shaking, and he, wanting to cope with his weakness, hit a nearby tree with his fist, smashing his knuckles into blood. At the same time, Guinevere entered the crown prince's office, greeting him. The blonde nodded, looking at her a little contemptuously, and asked why she was alone and where his younger brother was. The girl bowed and said that Gawain did not warn her and went somewhere on his own. The prince turned around and asked her to tell his brother that upon his return he would immediately come to him. Guinevere bowed, and the prince hurried away. Lady Florence entered the room and asked her if everything was all right. Having calmed the girl, the blonde noticed something on the sofa where the prince was sitting. The girls picked up the bag and realized that the crown prince had dropped it. Guinevere assured Lady Florence that she would bear the loss herself. Telling the dark-haired girl not to worry, she hurried to catch up with the prince and his servants. There were many servants and workers scurrying around in the castle courtyard, all of them busy with their own affairs. The girl found the prince's servant, Patrick, and he asked her why she had come here. Guinevere handed him the bag, saying that the crown prince had forgotten this thing. Patrick began to thank the girl, but they were interrupted by a knight approaching, moving closer to the man and whispering something not entirely good to him. Guinevere did not hear their conversation, but Patrick explained that he had urgent business, and therefore it was time for them to say goodbye. A few days later, a guest sent by Prince Gawain arrived at Duke Lancelot's estate, and he turned out to be Roger's Cohen. The Duke was surprised by such a visit, but Roger said that he had an assignment and gave Lancelot a letter. Putting it on the table, Roger suddenly said that he was in a hurry, and they could talk normally next time in the Imperial Palace, and then left, leaving the Duke at a loss. Lancelot quickly glanced over the text of the letter and became paler than usual, excitement sparkling in his eyes. He stood up, resting his palms on the table from an overabundance of emotions. Walking out into the corridor, he saw his servant and informed him that he immediately wanted to go to the Imperial Palace. Having arrived at his destination, Lancelot went to Gawain's office. He looked angry and tense, and also demanded an explanation because the letter he sent contained too little information. Gawain was tense and confused. He explained that this was an order from His Majesty, which they were all forced to obey. They agreed to wait for Guinevere to discuss the matter, and Lancelot said that if the prince had sent Rogers to him, the matter was serious indeed. Gawain explained that if he had sent any other person, his brother would have easily found out about this. The men exchanged a few words about the crown prince, and Lancelot said that he decided that he had taken the side of Prince Gawain. The red-haired man firmly stated that he endlessly repeated to his brother that he had no claims to the throne. Gawain admitted that he did not understand what caused his brother's behavior. Lancelot suggested that he might be worried about his current status as the youngest heir. The red-haired young man thought about such an explanation for his brother's anger. The prince rubbed his forehead with his hand, muttering that he only wanted to survive. Their conversation about the crown prince was interrupted by Guinevere, who came on the prince's orders. Lancelot looked at her a little surprised, but more excited. Gawain assured the girl that she should be present at this conversation, and asked to sit next to the Duke, which the girl did. The prince folded his palms and expressed his joy that they had all finally gathered. Gawain asked her to tell her what happened, and the girl nodded, saying that everything happened 4 days ago. The prince said that his brother's followers were probably sending people to him, but he could not understand why his brother would deliberately leave his wallet there. After a short conversation, the prince announced that from that day on they would correspond. They did not have time to move when the servant shouted to the crown prince had arrived. Appearing as if out of nowhere, Gawain's older brother opened the office doors. The red-haired youth began to sweat when the crown prince said that it had been difficult for him to see his younger brother lately. Seeing two not the most expected people, the crown prince was stunned and immediately thought that these three were plotting. Gawain said that just the other day he was going to visit his brother and called him to the others. Coming forward, the Duke bowed to the prince, and he said that he wanted to see the hero of the empire more often. Without listening to any objections, the crown prince added that there was no one other than the Duke of Armagh to call a hero. Calling Lancelot the pride of the empire, the blonde sat down on the sofa, keeping a smile on his face, and then called the others to join him, and those present obediently sat down. Gawain told his brother that he could see the guests off if he suddenly wanted to talk in private. The crown prince assured him that there was absolutely no need for this. Not even a minute had passed when the eldest brother announced that he had changed his mind, and the youngest asked him what he meant. The young man folded his arms and stated that he needed to discuss some things with Mrs. Pugh. Lancelot felt icy sweat appear on his forehead from worry and fear for the woman he loved. Guinevere agreed, and according to etiquette, received Prince Gawain's permission to have this conversation. Then she followed the eldest of the brothers into the corridor, wondering what he wanted. He stopped and directly asked the girl why she was working with Gawain, to which she replied that she was only following the emperor's orders. The crown prince stated that this answer is different from what he knows. Stepping towards the girl, he smiled insidiously and said that if she wanted to stay in the palace, she should be more careful. Turning on his heel, the crown prince told her that it was time for them to move on. Later, the girl and the prince sat in his office and leisurely tried the tea brought by the maid. Guinevere put the cup on the saucer and asked what His Majesty wanted to talk to her about. The crown prince picked up a bag familiar to her and said that he called her because of this, and in gratitude, he wanted to give her a gift without listening to objections. He raised his hand, calling her to silence, and advised her to listen carefully to what he said next. The prince asked why, in her opinion, the emperor chose her for this job and what he had in mind. The girl only replied that it was difficult to answer such a question. The blonde clapped his hands under his chin and asked for forgiveness, saying that he had asked too difficult a question. Guinevere smiled slightly and said that if the prince knew about his father's plans, she would ask him to share them with her. The young man agreed with a smile and said that if the girl didn't know, he would tell her everything. Prince Caled vaguely told her that the Emperor wanted to use her in his dirty deeds, and although Guinevere herself guessed about this, she thanked him for the information, and then, as a gift, told the prince that a smuggler was hiding in his ranks. The blonde froze, looking at the girl in disbelief and asking if he heard something. Guinevere replied that he could see for himself, and then expressed the hope that such a gift was a worthy response. The prince chuckled slightly, reminding her that the word was not a sparrow. The girl smiled and said that she would take note and definitely check his words. Smiling, she added that he should hurry up in his search, because if the emperor found out about this, he would have serious problems. The prince abruptly stood up from the table and said that he would check the information, and if it turned out to be false, then he would report everything to Gawain, who would probably be upset, after which he declared that the conversation was over. Guinevere bowed and left, and the prince struck the table with his fist in rage. A familiar silhouette appeared in the courtyard of the estate. Jero was approaching the crown prince's servant, Patrick. He bowed politely and expressed his condolences on the unexpected death of his father. Jero skillfully burst into tears and said through his sobs that he was most likely in a better place. Clearing his throat and not knowing how to react to these tears, Patrick suggested that he leave now. Deciding that he didn't need any extra problems, Jero nodded readily and followed him. The next day, in Prince Khaled's office, Patrick presented him with all the information he had collected about Jero's adoptive father. The prince's eyes ran over the lines. He wanted to quickly catch something interesting and then froze. Shocked by what he read, he looked up at Patrick. Repeating the words from the papers, he said that the man had an accident, the only witness of which was Jero himself. All the servants were fired for minor reasons. The prince shook his head and told Patrick to continue collecting information about Bright and dig deeper. Deciding to check Guinevere's information, he asked the servant how many people were really on his side. He thought for a moment and replied that many supported him, but under the prince's inquisitive gaze, he corrected himself and said that there were about 5 people on his side. The prince decided to manipulate possible feelings of guilt and explained that he was telling him this because he considered him the only person he could trust. Finally, he gave the servant the task of quietly checking if there was anything suspicious about the other 5. The next day at Arundite Castle, Lady Florence offered her assistance in the work of Mrs. Pugh. Having received a soft negative answer, the dark-haired girl smiled, saying that she thought so, because Guinevere learns quickly and copes with work, and also noted that this is probably why His Majesty trusts her so much. Guinevere smiled and asked if Lady Florence was talking about His Majesty Gawain. The girl agreed, but said that she was a little worried. Not understanding her words, Mrs. Pugh asked with a smile what she was talking about, but Lady Florence hesitated. She apologized, saying that she had said too much, and turned around to leave. Guinevere froze in the middle of the corridor, puzzled by the strange behavior of her friend. A little later, the girl called out to Lady Florence and hurried after her. Having overtaken her, Guinevere exhaled and asked if the dark-haired girl had heard any rumors about her. Lady Florence mumbled embarrassedly, explaining that everyone was whispering that Mrs. Pugh had gotten into the palace too easily compared to others. Guinevere pretended to breathe a sigh of relief and asked if there were any other rumors about her, but Lady Florence said that people did not talk about anything else. The blonde girl took her friend's hands and called her the only friend in this palace, the only person you can trust. During the day, Gawain sat in his study and tried to understand what happened to Uncle Jero, knowing full well that he could have died at the hands of his nephew. He rubbed his face with his palm and tried to find that little thing that he was losing sight of. Having agreed to the request to enter, Gawain greeted Rogers in surprise. The young man smiled and said that the prince was sitting so quietly in the office as if he was not here at all. Gawain invited Rogers to sit down and thanked him for the last time the guy delivered a letter to the Earl. The prince asked who sent him this time, suggesting that it might be his mother, and Rogers confirmed this, looking at how the red-haired heir thoughtfully rubbed his face with his palm. Their conversation was interrupted by Lady Florence, who prepared tea. She placed the cup in front of the prince, and he asked her to call Lady Pugh. Rogers asked if he needed to leave, but Gawain only replied that the guy would also need to hear what was being discussed. Guinevere was walking calmly down the corridor when Lady Florence called to her. The girl told Mrs. Pugh that Prince Gawain was immediately waiting for her in his office, and then added that she wanted to talk to her when she was free. The blonde hurried to the prince, who said that he had been waiting for her and asked her to sit down. Gawain asked what Lady Pugh talked about with the crown prince, and she replied that he thanked her for returning the forgotten item to him. At first, the prince expressed disbelief at his brother's behavior, but then he smiled, saying that he was glad that nothing bad had happened. Having introduced Guinevere and Rogers, Gawain said that now this young man would convey to them the words and opinions of Lancelot for security purposes. The girl hastened to assure that she would be honored to have such communication with Rogers. After several phrases, the prince asked the girl to leave them alone, and she bowed and left. Rogers expressed doubt that the crown prince called the girl just to thank him, and Gawain agreed with him. The guy suggested that the red-haired heir hire people who could complete the picture, but Gawain refused, saying that this was not necessary yet. Already in the corridor, Guinevere again met Rogers, who was following her. Stopping and turning around, the girl said that he was clearly watching her, just a little more, and she screamed in fright. Rogers asked for forgiveness for his rudeness and openly spoke of his distrust, peering into the girl's gloomy face, and then asked to still tell the whole truth to Gawain, even if the crown prince forbade it. Having finished this conversation, the young man said goodbye and hurried away. Stopping after a few steps, he added that Prince Gawain was very worried right now and she could come to him later. After this conversation, Guinevere walked in the garden and reflected on everything that was happening. Later, the girl went to meet Lady Florence, who stated that there was a tense atmosphere in the crown prince's palace. Lady Florence explained that she knew everything from a friend who worked there, and Guinevere noted with a smile that it was commendable for Prince Gawain's subordinates to know such details. The dark-haired girl with a bright smile exclaimed that she was ready to serve His Majesty and help them in everything. A little perplexed, Lady Florence asked Mrs. Pugh why she was smiling. The girl praised the dark-haired beauty for her honesty and sincerity, to which she responded with embarrassed objections. Guinevere asked Lady Florence about Mr. Rogers, and she told her that the young men had known each other since childhood, and Rogers was the night guard of this family, and then asked the reason for Mrs. Pugh's interest. The fair-haired one answered that the main reason for her was her interest in someone with whom Prince Gawain was very friendly. Lady Florence asked if anything had happened during Roger's visit, and upon receiving a negative answer, she clasped her hands together and thanked God. Guinevere took her hands and asked her not to worry so much, because now they were close enough to help each other. Giro went into his late uncle's office, remembering that he constantly called him here and scolded him over little things. He walked up to the table and said out loud how difficult it was for him to frame the murder of a relative as an accident. Climbing onto the table, Giro thought that now he would become the head of the clan. Hearing the call of a servant calling for departure, he jumped off the table and responded that he was already on his way. Giro opened the door right in front of the annoying servant. He looked him up and down, threatening him with one silent glance, and walked forward, clasping his hands behind his back. That same day, Giro arrived at the palace of Prince Kalad, who smiled at him when he met, and said that they had not seen each other for a long time. Bringing the usual tears to his eyes, dark-haired Bry said that thanks to the help of the crown prince, he was able to overcome all adversity. Having received the handkerchief from the prince, Giro thought that he was already disgusted with himself, but continued the game. A servant appeared and announced that the emperor had already approved the transfer of the title to Mr. Giro. All that remained was to wait for the documents to be signed, and the young man, hearing this, bowed his head before the prince. Giro said that if he could help the prince in any way, he would do everything. Suddenly, Kaled announced that he had unfinished business. He handed the paper to Bright with a smile. Giro quickly read what was written and was unable to believe it, and therefore asked whether Guinevere was really being released from punishment, and the prince confirmed this, speaking about the will of his father. The young man sat back and hunched over, shaking the walls with an accusatory cry addressed to the girl. He stood up and slammed the table, calling Guinevere trash. The prince called for calm and said that first they need to fabricate evidence that will indicate the girl's involvement in the death of his uncle. Giro froze, not expecting such a turn of events. Kaled explained this by saying that this way Giro could take revenge, and the prince himself could change His Majesty's mind, and then he took out a bag of jewelry and threw it to the young man. Having caught the thing, Giro asked what it was. The prince ordered him to open the bag, and Bright obeyed, untying the strings. A whole bunch of precious stones and metals ended up in his hands. Listening to Giro's gratitude, the prince said that now he faces many problems, and the gift should be used wisely. Lady Florence walked along the corridor, wondering why the crown prince would send his man here so soon if he had only recently come in person. She was called and told that Prince Gawain was looking for her. Lady Florence asked her friend Guinevere to finish preparing, and she agreed with a smile. A dark-haired girl came to the prince's office, and he asked her what was happening, because he himself had recently returned from a trip. Lady Florence handed him an envelope, saying that he would find the answer in the letter. Gawain saw that Kaled had sent him, and thought that this explained all the running around. The prince barely had time to say goodbye to Lady Florence when that same guest, Jiro Bright, entered his office. Jiro smiled and said that he was a guest sent here by the Crown Prince thanks to Gawain. He said that he did not remember any help that he could provide to Bright. Jiro hastened to change the subject and suggested getting straight to the point while asking Guinevere to stay. The girl mentally concluded that this man had come to intimidate her again, but remained calmly standing in place. Jiro acted arrogantly and said that he had business with Lady Bright and needed Prince Gawain's permission. The prince asked him to first describe the essence of the matter in more detail, and Jiro calmly and even laughingly stated that the girl was involved in the death of his uncle. Continuing his game, the young man said that his relative died immediately after Guinevere's visit, and she must undergo testing, since she is a suspect. Gawain said that he couldn't blame a girl simply because of his fantasies, but Jiro, with a nasty smile, took out some kind of document and handed it to the prince. Gawain began to read and was horrified, asking Jiro why he was doing this and why he needed all this. He calmly replied that he had his own reasons for this. Guinevere asked if she could speak, and Bright said with a smile that he didn't mind. Gawain nodded and said that this is about the fate of the girl. She should not silently listen to everything that others say. He looked at the document again and repeated that she had the right to express her point of view. The blonde bowed gratefully to the prince. She said that she was sure that the whole case was fabricated, but she was ready to undergo all thorough checks in order to protect herself. Jiro said that he completely agreed with her and that a thorough and fair investigation should be carried out here, to which the prince asked him to come out so that he and Lady Pugh could talk in private. Bright left, and Guinevere said that she had been waiting for something like this from him for a long time. She assured the prince that she had thought out a plan for such an eventuality, and that he need not worry. And Gawain replied that he felt as if she was robbing him of his last opportunity to fight. He said that every time he wants to help her, but she prefers to fight alone. The girl did not have time to answer, because it was time to call Jiro again. He entered the office, looking at Guinevere's silhouette from the back. Gawain asked what he planned to do next, and Bright replied that he would carry out all kinds of checks. Having received permission from the red-haired prince to carry out those same checks, Jiro thanked him, bowed, and walked away. Gawain sat down at the table, not understanding why his brother would so cruelly target those people who were so dear to him.